The mop left wet streaks across the polished floor, and Roy Fletcher followed them with his eyes while his hands worked on autopilot. Third shift on Station Harmony meant empty hallways and quiet thoughts, which suited him just fine. He'd been pushing this same cleaning cart for 2 years now, ever since the accident at the construction site left his back too damaged for heavy lifting. The pay was worse, the respect non-existent, but at least nobody bothered him. Through the classroom window, he could see the tail end of evening study sessions. Alien children from a dozen different worlds clustered around tables, their strange forms bent over datapads and holographic displays. Roy had learned to recognize most species by now. The tall gray ones were Drasnian, built like living concrete. The floating jellyfish types were Theshan, all tentacles and bioluminescent communication. And there, in the far corner, sat the small translucent figure that Roy had been noticing more and more lately. The kid was Quillen, according to the nameplate on the desk. Pip, it said. Just Pip. The child's skin glowed faintly with soft blue and green patterns that shifted like oil on water. Roy had read somewhere that Quillens expressed emotion through light, though he didn't know enough to interpret what the dim, flickering patterns might mean. What he did understand was isolation. While other students worked in groups, Pip sat alone, small hands moving hesitantly across a datapad. Roy moved his cart further down the hallway, positioning himself near the water recycler so he could keep watching without being obvious. 3 larger students entered the classroom, led by a Drasnian kid whose name tag read Brock. The boy stood nearly twice Pip's height, his rocky gray skin marked with the clan symbols that meant something important in his culture. His 2 friends followed close behind, a Theshan and another Drasnian, both wearing the same expression of casual cruelty that Roy recognized from his own childhood back on Earth. Brock walked past Pip's desk, and his elbow knocked a stack of learning tablets to the floor. The crash echoed through the quiet room. Pip's lights dimmed further, patterns stuttering into something that looked like fear. The small Quillen bent down to gather the scattered tablets while Brock and his friends laughed, the sound carrying through the door. Other students glanced over, saw what was happening, and deliberately looked away. Roy's grip tightened on the mop handle. He knew that look. That universal decision to pretend you didn't see, to avoid making yourself the next target. He'd seen it on Earth, and apparently it existed across every species in the galaxy. The teacher, an elderly Quillen with bright silver patterns, stood at the front of the room focused on her display, either unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. The evening session ended, and students filed out past Roy's cleaning cart. Brock shoved past without acknowledging him. Most species on the station treated human workers as part of the furniture, useful for maintenance, but not worth actual interaction. Roy had stopped caring about that months ago. He watched Pip emerge last, small arms clutching the recovered tablets against a narrow chest. The child's lights were still dim, pulsing weakly. Their eyes met for just a moment. Pip's were large and dark, set in a face that seemed too fragile for the harsh realities of Station Harmony. Roy nodded slightly, unsure if the gesture meant anything to a Quillen. The child's patterns flickered once, twice, then Pip hurried away down the corridor. Roy returned to mopping, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd been in that position once a long time ago. Small for his age, quiet, the kid who ate lunch alone while others formed their tight social circles. He remembered the adults who had seen and done nothing, too busy or too indifferent to care. He'd promised himself back then that if he ever had the chance, he'd be different. That promise felt hollow now, worn down by station regulations and the clear hierarchy that placed humans firmly at the bottom of the service ladder. The next evening, Roy timed his rounds to overlap with the end of classes again. He told himself it was just coincidence, that the education wing simply needed more attention lately. Through the window, he watched Brock deliberately move Pip's chair while the small Quillen was at the material dispenser. When Pip returned and nearly fell, the other students snickered. The lights under the child's skin strobed in distress before settling into a dull, steady glow that somehow seemed worse than the flickering. Roy found himself cleaning the same section of floor 3 times, unable to look away. A supervisor would reprimand him for wasting time, but third shift meant no supervisors, just cameras that rarely got reviewed unless something went seriously wrong. His daughter used to say he had a stubborn streak, that once Roy Fletcher decided something wasn't right, he couldn't just walk away. She meant it as a compliment. Mostly. She'd been gone 5 years now, taken by a disease that Earth medicine couldn't cure fast enough on the third night. Roy watched Brock spill something near Pip's desk. The liquid was pale green and gave off sharp chemical fumes even through the closed door. Pip stood quickly, lights flashing alarm red, and moved to a different seat. The teacher called for a cleanup, and Roy used his master access to enter the classroom. Up close, the spill was caustic cleaning solution, the kind that could burn Quillen's skin on contact. Someone had brought it from a maintenance closet specifically for this purpose. Roy cleaned it thoroughly, documenting the chemical signature on his datapad as required by safety protocols. When he finished, he looked up and found Pip watching him from the new seat across the room. The child's lights shifted through colors Roy couldn't name, patterns he didn't understand. But there was something in those dark eyes that he recognized completely. It was hope, fragile and desperate, the kind that came from seeing one person, just one, who noticed you existed. Roy gathered his supplies and left without speaking. Station regulations were clear. Human workers did not interact with alien students beyond necessary custodial functions. Interference in educational matters meant immediate termination, possibly deportation back to Earth. He had bills to pay, a small apartment to maintain, a routine that kept him functional. But that night, lying in his narrow bunk, Roy couldn't stop seeing those flickering lights and those desperate eyes. He couldn't stop remembering his daughter in her final days, asking why the universe seemed so cruel to small things. He'd had no answer then. Maybe he could find one now, even if it cost him everything he had left. Roy started arriving 10 minutes earlier to his shift, which meant he could position his cleaning cart near the recreational courtyard where students gathered before evening classes. The cart was bulky and took up half the corridor width, creating a natural barrier that forced foot traffic to flow around it. He made sure to park it between the courtyard entrance and the classroom wing, right where Pip would have to pass. The first time Brock and his friends approached and found their usual interception route blocked by cleaning equipment, they shot Roy an irritated look but moved around him. Pip slipped past on the other side, lights brightening slightly. Roy sprayed cleaner on the same window panel for the fourth time, pretending not to notice that it became a pattern. Roy found reasons to clean in places where Pip seemed most vulnerable. The water fountain, where Brock liked to corner the smaller student during breaks, suddenly needed daily maintenance. The corridor intersection, where the bullies waited after classes, developed a mysterious recurring stain that required Roy's constant attention. He never spoke to Pip, never acknowledged what he was doing, just moved his cart, pushed his mop, and happened to be in the right place at the right time. After a week, Pip started appearing near wherever Roy was working. The child didn't approach directly, just stayed within visual range, studying or reading on a datapad. Roy understood. Sometimes just having one person nearby who wasn't actively hostile made the world feel less dangerous. He'd felt that way himself once, staying close to the school librarian who'd never ask questions but always let him hide in the back corner during lunch. The uneasy balance lasted 2 weeks before it shattered. Roy found Pip's cultural learning tablet smashed in a recycling chute. The screen cracked and circuits exposed. The device was expensive, calibrated specifically for Quillen physiology and their light-based interface. Roy pulled it out carefully and ran a diagnostic. Deliberately destroyed, not accidentally damaged. Someone had applied enough force to break the reinforced casing. He filed a maintenance report, documenting the damage and the location. Station protocol required logging all destroyed equipment. The report went to Administrator Vorn, a Quillen himself, who ran the education wing with bureaucratic efficiency. Roy hoped that seeing one of his own species' children being targeted might prompt action. The response came back 3 days later. Equipment malfunction due to user error. Student family will be charged for replacement. Advise proper handling procedures going forward. Roy read the message twice, anger building in his chest. User error. As if Pip had somehow smashed the device against the inside of a recycling chute. He wanted to march up to Vorn's office and demand real investigation, but he knew how that would end. Human janitors didn't make demands of alien administrators. Instead, he started keeping his own records. Times, dates, incidents he witnessed. It wasn't much, but it was something that he found Pip eating lunch in a storage closet 3 days after the tablet incident. The door was ajar, and Roy spotted the faint glow from inside while doing his rounds. The child sat on an overturned supply crate, picking at food that looked like crystallized gel cubes. The lights under Pip's skin pulsed in slow, sad rhythms. Roy hesitated, then made a decision that probably violated a dozen station regulations. He pulled out his own lunch, a simple sandwich that the commissary made for human workers. He sat down on another crate across from Pip and unwrapped it slowly. The child's eyes went wide, lights flickering uncertainty. "You eat in here a lot?" Roy asked, keeping his voice gentle. Pip's lights shifted through several colors before the child spoke, voice soft and musical. "The cafeteria is loud and crowded." Roy nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The cafeteria was where Brock and his friends ruled, where being different made you a target. He broke his sandwich in half and offered part of it. "Want to try Earth food?" Pip stared at the offered food, then slowly reached out and took it. Small fingers examined the bread and contents with careful curiosity. "Thank you. Others do not share. Others are idiots," Roy said, then caught himself. Shouldn't have said that. But Pip's lights brightened slightly, patterns dancing faster. "My family came here 6 months ago. We fled from our homeworld. There was fighting. Many died." The child's voice dropped. "We were lucky to escape. Administrator Vorn reminds us of this often." The pieces clicked together in Roy's mind. Refugees, people with no power, no connections, no ability to make demands or complaints. Families who stayed quiet because they feared deportation more than they feared their children being hurt. He'd seen the same thing on Earth. Immigrants afraid to report abuse because it might mean losing everything. "Your family shouldn't have to choose between safety and silence," Roy said. "That's not luck. That's being trapped." Pip looked at him for a long moment, lights settling into a steady blue-green glow. "You're the cleaning person. You watch sometimes." "I have noticed." "Yeah, well, somebody should." They sat in silence for a while, sharing the sandwich. Roy learned that Pip loved mathematics and wanted to study stellar engineering, that the child's mother worked in station hydroponics and the father processed recycling in the lower decks, that Pip had a younger sibling who hadn't started school yet, and the family lived in fear that the bullying might extend there too. When the break period ended, they both left the storage closet separately. Roy went back to his cart, and Pip headed to class. But something had shifted. They both knew it, though neither said anything. That evening, Roy returned to his usual monitoring position outside the classroom. He watched Brock and his friends whispering among themselves, shooting looks in Pip's direction. Something was different. They seemed agitated, purposeful. Roy's instincts, honed from years of construction work where reading crew dynamics could prevent accidents, screamed warning. The class ended and students filed out. Brock and his group lingered, letting others pass. Pip gathered materials slowly, clearly trying to wait them out. The teacher left, lights dimming as she powered down the classroom systems. Roy watched as the 3 bullies moved to block the main exit, but he didn't think. Just pushed his cart forward and entered the classroom using his maintenance access. "Evening cleaning," he announced, voice flat. "Need everyone out." Brock turned, irritation clear on his rocky features. "We just left. Room's clean. New protocols. Daily deep sanitization." Roy moved his cart between the bullies and Pip, making the lie sound official. "Out. Now." The Theshan floating beside Brock pulsed with annoyed colors. "You cannot order us around, human." Roy met the alien's gaze steadily. "I can when it comes to safety protocols. Station Regulation 47B. You want to argue it with my supervisor?" They left, shooting dark looks at both Roy and Pip. When the door closed behind them, Roy turned to find the small Quillen staring at him, lights blazing bright yellow. "They know you are helping me now," Pip whispered. Roy nodded slowly, already knowing what that meant. The invisible barrier he'd maintained was gone. He'd crossed a line, made himself visible, inserted himself directly into something he had no authority to be part of. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." The summons to Administrator Vorn's office arrived on Roy's datapad at the start of his next shift. He'd been expecting it, honestly. Word traveled fast on a space station, especially when a human service worker started stepping outside established boundaries. He clocked in, left his card in the storage bay, and made his way to the administrative level. Vorn's office was twice the size of Roy's living quarters, decorated with crystals that pulsed with soft light in patterns that probably meant something in Quillen culture. The administrator sat behind a curved desk, his own skin glowing with steady, controlled rhythms. Professional, authoritative, everything Pip wasn't yet. "Mr. Fletcher," Vorn said, his voice carrying the musical quality all Quillens shared. "We need to discuss your recent activities." Roy stood in front of the desk, hands clasped behind his back. Old military posture, something that came back when he needed to present strength. "I filed all required maintenance reports." "This is not about maintenance." Vorn's lights shifted to orange, irritation clear even to Roy's untrained eye. "Multiple students have reported that you're interfering with their movements, blocking corridors, entering classrooms without proper authorization. I have full maintenance access to all educational facilities. For cleaning purposes, yes. Not for inserting yourself into student affairs." Vorn leaned forward. "You do understand your role here, correct? You're a support staff. You maintain facilities. You do not involve yourself in educational matters or student interactions." Roy felt his jaw tighten. Even when a student is being hurt. Vorn's lights flickered briefly before resetting to professional orange. "Young people have conflicts. It is natural, part of learning social dynamics across species. We cannot intervene in every minor disagreement. Destroying another student's equipment isn't a minor disagreement. That matter was investigated and resolved. User error was determined to be the cause." "That's a lie." The words came out before Roy could stop them. The office went very quiet. Vorn's lights blazed bright red. Anger and authority combined. "You are accusing me of dishonesty? You, a human cleaning worker, are questioning my administrative decisions." Roy knew he should back down, apologize, protect his job and his place on the station. But he kept seeing Pip's dim, frightened lights in that storage closet. Kept remembering his daughter asking why adults let bad things happen to small people. "I'm saying that a child is being systematically targeted and abused, and the people in charge are choosing not to see it because it's easier than dealing with it." Vorn stood, his considerable height making Roy crane his neck upward. "The child you're referring to comes from a refugee family with no status, no connections, no formal petition for permanent residency. They are here on provisional acceptance, which can be revoked at any time. Perhaps if Pip were better at adapting to station life, there would be fewer difficulties." The words hung in the air like poison. Roy felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're saying the victim is the problem. I am saying that integration requires effort from all parties. Now, Mr. Fletcher, you will return to your duties and cease this inappropriate involvement. Consider this a formal warning. Another incident, and you will be terminated. Do I make myself clear?" Roy nodded slowly. Crystal clear. He left the office knowing exactly what message had been delivered. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Let the system grind on, because fighting it only destroys you. He'd heard variations of this his entire life, from teachers who ignored bullying to supervisors who covered up safety violations. The accent changed, but the message stayed the same. The field trip was announced 3 days later. Educational excursion to the station's observation deck, where students could see the nebula and learn about stellar formation. Roy wasn't scheduled to work during the trip, but he found himself unable to stay away. Something felt wrong, an itch at the back of his mind that he couldn't ignore. That he arrived at the observation deck during setup, claiming he needed to check the deck's maintenance systems. The teacher supervising barely acknowledged him, too busy organizing students into groups. Roy spotted Pip standing alone near the back, small figure dwarfed by the massive viewing windows. Brock and his friends clustered nearby, whispering among themselves and shooting glances at the isolated Quillen. The observation deck was impressive, Roy had to admit. Curved transparent panels offered an unobstructed view of space, stars scattered like diamonds against black velvet. One section included an emergency airlock system, clearly marked and protected by multiple safety protocols. The teacher began her lecture about stellar evolution, students gathering around her holographic display. Roy positioned himself near the maintenance panel, running fake diagnostics while keeping Pip in his peripheral vision. Brock's group started drifting toward the Quillen child, moving with a casual predatory grace that made Roy's instincts scream. They cornered Pip near the airlock section, three larger bodies forming a wall. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Pip's lights start strobing in panic. Saw Brock reach out and shove the smaller student toward the airlock controls. The bullies were laughing, treating it like a joke, probably not intending real harm. Just intimidation. Just terror for fun. But Roy had work instruction. He knew how quickly jokes turned into accidents when you played near dangerous equipment. The airlock had multiple safety systems, yes, but he also knew that every safety system had been installed because someone once died without it. Brock pressed Pip against the airlock panel, and warning lights began flashing. The proximity sensors had activated. The emergency system, designed to detect hull breaches, interpreted the pressure against the controls as potential damage. Automated warnings blared through speakers. Roy moved before he fully decided to move. Crossed the deck in long strides and grabbed Brock's arm, yanking the Drasnian youth away from both Pip and the airlock. The boy stumbled backward, shot clear on his rocky face. His friends froze and used anyone actually stopping them. "Back off," Roy said, voice low and hard. "Now!" The alarm continued blaring. Other students turned to stare. The teacher rushed over, lights flashing confusion and alarm. And security cameras, Roy knew, were recording every second. Station security arrived within minutes. Two officers, one Theshan and one from a species Roy didn't recognize. They took statements, reviewed camera footage, documented the incident. Through it all, Roy stood between Pip and the bullies, refusing to move even when ordered. The aftermath was predictable. The security officers escorted Roy to a holding area while they investigated the incident. Brock and his friends received brief questioning and minor warnings about staying away from emergency equipment. Pip's parents were contacted, their lights dim with fear as they arrived to collect their child. Roy sat in the holding cell, watching through the transparent barrier as Pip's mother spoke with security. He could see her lights, stuttering with terror, could read the desperation in her posture even without understanding Quillen body language. She was begging them not to make trouble, begging them to forget this happened, begging to avoid any attention that might threaten their refugee status. When Roy was finally released pending full investigation, he found Pip's father waiting outside. The Quillen male's lights were dim, controlled, careful. "My mate wishes me to thank you," he said quietly, "but also to ask you to stop. We cannot afford attention. We cannot afford trouble. If we are seen as problematic, they will send us away. Our home is gone. We have nowhere else." Roy understood. He hated it, but he understood. And if Pip gets hurt, really hurt, the father's lights dimmed further. Then we will have lost a child, but perhaps saved the rest of our family. It is a calculation we refugees make every day. He walked away, leaving Roy alone in the corridor. The suspension notice came an hour later. Pending investigation into unauthorized physical contact with alien students and interference with educational activities. Roy went home knowing his job was probably gone, knowing he'd made things worse for Pip's family, knowing the system had won again. But he also knew he'd made his choice. And somehow, despite everything, he couldn't regret it. Suspension meant Roy had too much time to think and nowhere productive to put his energy. He spent 3 days in his small apartment, watching news feeds and trying not to obsess about what might be happening in the education wing without him there. On the 4th day, Dr. Una Westfield showed up at his door. She was the station's human medical officer, one of the few humans with an actual professional position rather than service work. Roy had met her twice before, both times for routine physical examinations required for station employment. She stood in his doorway holding a medical data pad, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said. "May I come in?" Roy stepped aside, gesturing to the cramped living area. She sat on his only chair while he leaned against the kitchen counter. She pulled up files on her datapad and turned the screen toward him. Pip came to medical 3 days ago with bruising across the torso and minor burns on both arms. The parents claimed the child fell during recreation time. The injuries don't match that story. She scrolled through images that made Roy's stomach tighten. "I'm required to report suspicious injuries, but Administrator Vorn classified this as accidental and closed the case within an hour. Why are you showing me this?" "Because somebody needs to see it. Somebody who gives a damn." She set the datapad down. Pip stopped attending classes entirely. The parents keep the child home now, terrified that if they make any formal complaints, they'll be deported. And Brock's group has gotten bolder. They know the system protects them. They know refugee families can't fight back. Roy felt fury building in his chest, cold and focused. "What do you want me to do?" "I am suspended. Probably getting fired. I have no authority, no standing. You have something better. You have the ability to be inconvenient." She stood, moving to the door. "There's a school assembly tomorrow. Cultural presentation in the main hall. All students required to attend. Vorn will be there, along with other administrators. Security will be light because it's considered a safe, controlled environment. You're suggesting I crash a school assembly while suspended. I'm suggesting that sometimes the only way to expose a problem is to make it impossible to ignore." She opened the door, then paused. "Your access codes haven't been fully revoked yet. Security systems take 72 hours to update. You have until tomorrow morning." She left before Roy could respond. He stood in his empty apartment, weighing options that all seemed terrible. Going back would probably mean criminal charges. Galactic Council took interference with alien children seriously, especially by humans. The species considered Earth dangerous, humans unpredictable. One wrong move, and he'd end up in a much worse cell than the holding area he'd been in before. But doing nothing meant leaving Pip alone with people who hurt children and faced no consequences for it. He thought about his daughter, who'd spent her final weeks asking him to make the universe make sense. He'd failed then. Maybe he didn't have to fail now. Roy showed up at the education wing 30 minutes before the assembly, using his old access codes to slip through a maintenance entrance. The hallways were empty, students already gathering in the main assembly hall. He moved quietly, checking rooms until he found what he was looking for. Pip huddled in a ventilation access point, tucked into a space barely large enough for the child's small frame. The Quillen's lights were almost completely dark, barely visible in the shadows. Bruises marked translucent skin, and the burns Dr. Westfield had mentioned were angry red welts on both forearms. "Hey," Roy said softly, crouching near the vent opening. "It's me." Pip's lights flickered weakly. "You're not supposed to be here. You were suspended." "Yeah, well, I'm bad at following rules when the rules are stupid." He pulled out the basic medical kit he'd brought, supplies Dr. Westfield had provided along with instructions. "Let me help with those burns." Pip crawled out slowly, movements careful like everything hurt. Up close, the injuries were worse than the photos suggested. Roy worked gently, applying treatment gel to the burns while Pip sat silently. The child's lights remained dim, barely pulsing. "They found me after you were gone," Pip said finally. "Said you could not protect me anymore. That no one would believe a refugee over them. Administrator Vorn told my parents that if we caused more trouble, our residency application would be denied. Where are your parents now?" "In the hydroponics bay. Working. They cannot risk losing their positions." Pip's voice was hollow, defeated. "I was supposed to attend the assembly. But I cannot. I cannot face them again." Roy finished treating the burns, packing up the medical supplies. He understood hiding. Understood the desperate need to make yourself small and invisible when the world felt too big and hostile. But he also understood that hiding only worked until it didn't. The sounds of students gathering in the nearby assembly hall filtered through the walls. Laughing, talking, the normal noise of young people unaware that one of their number was hiding in a ventilation shaft covered in injuries. Come on, Roy said, offering his hand. You're not hiding anymore. What? We're going to that assembly. Together. Pip's lights flared in panic. No, they will hurt me worse. They'll do it in front of everyone this time. That's the difference. Roy kept his hand extended. I can't promise it won't be scary, but I can promise you won't face it alone. For a long moment, Pip just stared at him. Then, slowly, small fingers wrapped around his hand. They emerged from the maintenance corridor just as the assembly was beginning. The hall was packed with students, teachers positioned around the perimeter. Administrator Vorn stood at the front, lights glowing in formal purple patterns as he prepared to address the crowd. Security was minimal, just 2 officers near the main entrance. Roy and Pip entered from the side, and heads began turning. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in water. Vorn's lights flashed irritation when he spotted them, but he maintained his formal composure. They made it halfway across the hall before Brock and his friends appeared, blocking their path. The Drasnian youth's expression was ugly, confident in his protected status. You don't belong here, Brock said, speaking to both Roy and Pip. Refugees and failed janitors should know their place. Other students were pulling out recording devices now, sensing drama. Perfect, Roy thought. Record all of it. Get out of our way, Roy said quietly. Make me human. Brock stepped closer, emboldened by the crowd and years of facing no consequences. His friends moved with him, forming a wall of larger bodies. Pip tried to step backward, but Roy held the child's hand firmly. Stay with me, he said. Brock reached out to shove Pip, the same casual violence that had probably worked 100 times before. But this time Roy moved, stepping between them and catching the Drasnian's arm before it made contact. Brock tried to pull free, and Roy held firm, years of construction work making his grip stronger than the youth expected. Don't touch the kid, Roy said. That's when the situation exploded. Brock's friends rushed forward, and Roy found himself fighting to protect Pip while not actually striking children. He pushed them back, blocked their attacks, used his body as a shield. It was messy, chaotic, and completely visible to everyone in the hall. Students were definitely recording now. Teachers rushed forward. Security officers shouted orders. And through it all, Roy kept himself between Pip and harm, taking hits he could have avoided, accepting bruises he could have prevented, because protecting the child mattered more than protecting himself. Administrator Vorn and security pulled them apart. Roy's nose was bleeding, his ribs aching. Brock looked shocked and used anyone actually fighting back. And Pip stood behind Roy, lights blazing brighter than they had in weeks, finally visible to everyone in the room. The detention cell had transparent walls, which meant Roy could see the chaos unfolding in the station commons beyond. What started as a few students gathered outside the security office had grown into something much larger. Young aliens from multiple species filled the open area, many holding data pads displaying images from the assembly hall incident. They weren't rioting or causing damage. They were just there, silent and present, refusing to leave as a security officer approached Roy's cell, a Theshan whose tentacles pulsed with uncertain colors. The council representatives have arrived. You will be questioned soon. Roy nodded, wiping dried blood from his upper lip. His ribs hurt when he breathed deeply, probably bruised, but not broken. Small price, all things considered. Through the transparent barrier, he watched a young Drasnian student hold up a datapad showing Pip's injuries. Another student, species Roy didn't recognize, projected a recording of Brock's attack at the assembly onto the wall. Dr. Westfield appeared in the commons, moving through the crowd of students with purpose. She was speaking with them, organizing them somehow. Roy couldn't hear what she was saying, but he saw students nodding, saw them begin arranging themselves into more structured groups. This wasn't random protest. This was becoming something deliberate. Hours passed. Roy dozed fitfully, his back against the cell wall. He woke to find Pip's parents standing outside his cell, flanked by a security escort. The mother's lights were chaotic, patterns he couldn't interpret. The father stood very still, lights dim and controlled. They say you fought students, the father said. They say you attacked children. I defended your child from children who were attacking first. Roy stood, moving closer to the barrier. The recordings will show what really happened. The mother's lights flashed bright red, and she spoke rapidly in her own language. The father translated, voice tight. She says, "You have destroyed everything, that we will be deported now, that the attention you have brought will end our family's chance at safety." Roy understood their fear. He'd probably made their situation worse in the short term. "I am sorry. I know I've complicated your lives." But Pip was being hurt, and nobody was stopping it. "We would have endured," the father said. "We have endured worse. Survival requires accepting hardship. It shouldn't require accepting abuse. Not for you. Not for Pip. Not for anyone." The mother spoke again, lights strobing with emotion. The father listened, then looked at Roy with something like resignation. "She says that in our home world, before the war, we had a word for people like you. It translates roughly to foolish guardian. Those who protect others even when it costs them everything. We considered it both honorable and tragic." They left without saying more, escorted away by security. Roy sat back down, uncertain whether their visit was meant as thanks or condemnation. Probably both. The council chambers were small, designed for administrative hearings rather than major trials. 5 representatives sat in a semicircle, each from a different species. Roy recognized the Theshan counselor and the Drasnian elder, but the others were unfamiliar. Administrator Vorn sat to one side, his lights carefully neutral. The charges were read in formal galactic standard. Unauthorized entry to educational facilities. Physical assault on minor students. Violation of species interaction protocols. Each one carried potential penalties ranging from deportation to actual imprisonment. Roy sat in the defendant's position, flanked by security. He had no legal representative, no formal defense prepared. The proceedings were meant to be straightforward. Human worker had overstepped boundaries. Punishment would be administered. Everyone could return to normal operations, except normal operations had apparently stopped being normal. The Theshan counselor called for evidence presentation, and recordings from the assembly hall played on holographic displays. They showed everything shot from multiple angles by students who'd been recording. Brock shoving Pip, Roy intercepting, the fight that followed. But they also showed what came before. Students noticed, started pulling up their own recordings, older footage from other incidents. Someone had compiled weeks of material. Pip being tripped in hallways. Equipment being damaged. The caustic chemical spill. The airlock incident. All documented, all ignored, all carefully preserved by students who'd been watching and waiting for someone to care about Dr. Westfield entered the chambers carrying her medical datapad. She approached the council with formal respect but unmistakable purpose. "I request permission to present medical evidence relevant to this case." The Theshan counselor gestured agreement. Dr. Westfield displayed Pip's injury records, comparing them to the official reports filed by Administrator Vorn. Every injury classified as accidental. Every complaint dismissed as refugee family being oversensitive. Pattern after pattern of systematic abuse, meeting systematic denial. "How many reports did you file regarding this student?" the Theshan counselor asked Vorn. 7 over 4 months. Vorn replied, lights carefully neutral. All investigated and resolved according to proper procedures. And yet the abuse continued. A new voice said. Everyone turned. A Quillen elder had entered the chambers, her lights blazing with formal authority patterns that made even the counselors sit straighter. Roy didn't know enough about Quillen culture to understand her rank, but her effect was immediate and obvious. "I am Council Elder Thessa," she announced. "I invoked override privilege when I learned that a Quillen child was involved in these proceedings." The Theshan counselor inclined his head respectfully. "Elder Thessa, your presence honors us. However, Quillen cultural law typically prevents youth from testifying in disciplinary matters. Quillen law also requires intervention when a child displays trauma patterns." Thessa moved to where Roy sat and examined him briefly before turning to address the full council. "I have reviewed the medical evidence. The light patterns documented in this child's injury reports indicate sustained psychological trauma. Under such circumstances, cultural testimony restrictions are void. The child must be heard." She gestured to the chamber entrance. Security brought Pip in, the small Quillen walking slowly between towering guards. Pip's parents followed, lights dim with fear and resignation. But when Pip saw Roy sitting in the defendant's position, the child's patterns brightened slightly. Elder Thessa spoke directly to Pip in their shared language, musical tones that Roy couldn't understand. Pip responded quietly at first, then with growing strength. The conversation went on for several minutes while translation devices struggled to keep up. When it finished, Thessa turned to the council. This child describes not just physical bullying, but systematic isolation, cultural mockery, and daily fear. More importantly, this child states that only one adult in this entire facility saw what was happening and chose to act. Not teachers, not administrators, not security. One human janitor who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The Drasnian elder on the council spoke up, his rocky features set in harsh lines. The human physically restrained my species' youth. Brock comes from a respected clan. This requires consequences. Brock comes from a respected clan that should be ashamed, Thessa replied sharply. I have contacted his family elders. They expressed deep dishonor at his actions and failure of character. They support whatever disciplinary measures are deemed appropriate. The hearing continued for hours. Other students gave statements, many speaking about incidents they'd witnessed but been too afraid to report. Human workers came forward, testifying about times they'd been told to ignore concerning situations. A picture emerged of systematic failure enabled by bureaucratic indifference. Through it all, Roy sat quietly, watching the process unfold. He'd expected quick punishment and deportation. Instead, he was watching the station's entire power structure being forced to confront its own complicity. Finally, the council recessed to deliberate. Roy was returned to his detention cell to wait. Outside, the student protest had grown larger. Now, parents were joining them. Human workers stood at the edges, watching carefully. Something had shifted on station harmony, and everyone could feel an emergency broadcast interrupted the waiting. All channels diverted to a priority alert. A Quillen refugee transport ship was under attack 2 hours from the station. Engines damaged, shields failing. Hundreds of refugees aboard, including families with young children. They were requesting emergency assistance. Station Harmony's defense systems were minimal, designed for meteor deflection and basic security. The attacking force was unknown, but clearly capable of destroying a civilian transport. Standard protocol would be to alert the nearest military installation and maintain defensive posture. But the military installation was 6 hours away. The refugees would be dead in 2. Roy watched through his cell wall as emergency staff rushed to positions. Alarms blared. The student protesters scattered, heading to designated shelters. And somewhere in the chaos, someone made a decision that Roy couldn't afford to wait in a cell while people died. His cell door opened. The security officer outside looked at him grimly. Station commander needs experienced personnel. Your military record says peacekeeping forces, tactical operations. We need you. Share. Roy ran through station corridors he'd cleaned 1,000 times, but now everything looked different through the lens of emergency. Red alert lighting painted familiar walls in harsh tones. Families rushed past carrying emergency supplies toward designated shelter zones. He reached the operations center to find controlled chaos. Multiple species working stations they'd probably only practiced using in drills. Station Commander Holloway, a gruff human woman Roy had seen maybe twice in 2 years, spotted him immediately. Fletcher, you did tactical assessment in the peacekeeping forces 12 years ago, yes ma'am. Good enough. We've got a civilian transport under attack, minimal weapons, shields failing. We need to get them here and coordinate evacuation. You work construction, you know the lower dock configurations better than anyone. Start planning refugee housing. Roy moved to a planning station, pulling up deck layouts while around him other personnel coordinated the defense response. It felt surreal, going from detention cell to emergency operations in minutes. But Crisis didn't care about whose hands were clean or dirty, just whose hands could work. The refugee transport appeared on long-range sensors, limping toward the station, trailing atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. The attacking vessels broke off once Station Harmony's minimal weapons came online, apparently unwilling to engage a fortified position. Small mercies. Medical teams to Docking Bay 3. Dr. Westfield's voice came over the intercom. Prepare for mass casualty situation. We're looking at potential radiation exposure, decompression injuries, and trauma. Roy coordinated with engineering to open the lower storage bays, spaces normally used for cargo, but large enough to house hundreds temporarily. His construction background made him useful for the first time since his injury ended that career. He knew load capacities, environmental systems, how to jury-rig living spaces from available materials. Pip appeared in the operations center, small figure somehow, making it past security checkpoints. The child's lights blazed urgent orange. Patterns Roy had learned meant determination. Pip moved directly to the communications station. I can translate, Pip said to the officer manning the console. Quillen dialects vary by region. The transport is from the southern continent. I speak that dialect. The communications officer looked uncertain, glancing at Commander Holloway. She nodded sharply. Put the kid on comms. We need clean communication. Pip worked the console with small, precise movements, speaking rapidly in musical Quillen tones. Through the translator, Roy heard fragments. Injury counts, hull breach locations, locations of children who needed priority extraction. The young Quillen worked with focused competence that reminded Roy of veteran combat medics he'd known, people who went calm and efficient when everything was falling apart. The transport docked messily, damaged maneuvering systems making the approach clumsy and dangerous. The moment airlocks connected, refugees poured out in controlled evacuation streams. Roy was there with his construction crew volunteers, guiding families toward temporary housing. They were terrified, traumatized, many injured. Children clung to parents. Parents carried those too hurt to walk. Brock appeared in the docking bay, followed by his two friends who'd been part of the bullying group. They weren't sneering now. They carried medical supplies, following Dr. Westfield's rapid-fire directions, helping younger children toward medical stations. The Drasnian youth spotted Roy and froze briefly, something like shame crossing his rocky features before he turned back to his assigned tasks. The crisis continued for hours. Medical teams worked through injuries. Engineering sealed hull breaches on the transport. Station resources stretched thin, housing hundreds of unexpected refugees. Roy worked until his back screamed in pain, old injury flaring from the physical demands. He didn't stop in a brief pause between coordinating housing assignments. Roy found Pip sitting on a cargo crate, lights dim with exhaustion. The child had worked communications for 6 straight hours, translating between traumatized refugees and station personnel. You did good work, Roy said, sitting beside the small Quillen. My little sibling was on that transport, Pip said quietly. Family we thought we had lost in the war. They were coming to join us. If the station had not helped. The child's lights flickered with emotion too complex for Roy to interpret. But we did help. You helped. Your translation probably saved lives. Because you taught me I could matter. Pip looked up at Roy with those large dark eyes. That one person choosing courage could make a difference. The emergency settled into exhausted cleanup over the following days. The refugee transport was repaired enough for basic function. The attacking mercenaries, pursued by arriving military vessels, fled the sector. Station Harmony absorbed hundreds of additional refugees into its population, straining resources but managing. The council reconvened Roy's hearing 3 days after the crisis ended. The chambers felt different now, less formal and more purposeful. The same 5 counselors sat in their positions, but the atmosphere had changed. The Theshan counselor spoke first. Roy Fletcher, you were charged with multiple violations of station protocols. However, circumstances have provided additional context. We have reviewed not just your actions, but the systematic failures that necessitated them. Elder Thessa stood beside the council. The Quillen community has submitted formal complaints regarding Administrator Vorn's handling of refugee families and student welfare. Those complaints are now under separate investigation. This hearing concerns only your actions. The Drasnian elder cleared his throat. My species representatives have spoken with young Brock and his family. The elders express deep shame at his behavior and the failure of supervision that enabled it. They support restorative justice measures that will be implemented. Roy waited, uncertain where this was leading. The Theshan counselor continued. You violated protocols. You entered restricted areas, interfered with student matters beyond your authority, and engaged in physical confrontation with minors. These actions cannot be ignored. He paused. However, you also identified and attempted to address a serious welfare issue that proper authorities had systematically failed to recognize. Your intervention, while procedurally incorrect, was ethically necessary. Formal reprimand will be placed in your record, another counselor added. You will not face criminal charges or deportation. Additionally, given your demonstrated commitment to student welfare and your organizational abilities during the recent crisis, we are offering you a position as Student Safety Coordinator. Roy blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. What? New position, created following this incident, Commander Holloway said from the back of the chamber. Someone needs to monitor student welfare across species lines, someone who actually gives a damn. You're qualified, you're proven, and frankly, you're too stubborn to ignore problems. Pays better than janitorial. You want it or not? Roy looked at Pip, who sat beside Elder Thessa, lights blazing bright yellow that he'd learned meant hope. He looked at Dr. Westfield, who smiled slightly from her observer position. He thought about his daughter, who'd wanted the universe to make sense. I want it, he said. 3 months later, Roy walked the education wing in his new capacity. The halls looked the same, but felt different. Students moved freely, mixing across species lines. Teachers monitored interactions actively rather than ignoring problems. New protocols required immediate reporting and investigation of any welfare concerns. Pip walked with a group of friends, multiple species including a young Drasnian who wasn't Brock, but was clearly helping the Quillen with a mathematics problem. The child's lights blazed steady and bright, patterns complex and confident. When Pip spotted Roy, those lights flickered in a pattern he'd learned meant greeting and affection. Roy's office was small but functional, walls covered with contact information for counselors, medical staff, and cultural advisors. His desk held the light crystal Pip had given him a month ago, traditional Quillen gratitude gift. Next to it sat a photo of his daughter, smiling in a way he tried to remember clearly. A nervous young student appeared at his door, species Roy was still learning to identify. The youth translator device crackled to life. Excuse me, sir. I am having problems with older students. They say things that hurt. I do not know what to do. Roy gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. The students sat, relief visible in their posture. Roy pulled out his datapad, opening a new incident report. He'd learned the formal procedures, the proper channels, the correct protocol for investigating and addressing student welfare concerns. But underneath all that bureaucracy, the core message remained simple. Someone was paying attention. Someone cared. Someone would act. Later that evening, Roy attended a community gathering in the station commons. The refugee families from the rescued transport had organized a cultural celebration, sharing food and music from their homeworld. Pip's reunited family sat together, lights synchronized in patterns that Roy had learned indicated family harmony. The younger sibling, barely more than a toddler in Quillen terms, played with other children while parents watched with careful attention. Brock approached Roy hesitantly, his rocky features set in uncertain lines. The young Drasnian had been going through restorative justice processes, working with counselors and doing community service. His formal clan punishment remained private, but Roy had heard it involved extensive education about respect and responsibility. Mr. Fletcher, Brock said, using the formal address he'd never bothered with before. I wanted to say, I am learning about what I did, about why it was wrong. My clan elders make me understand that strength without honor is just cruelty. Roy nodded. Learning's harder than knowing, but it matters more. Pip helped me, Brock continued. Explain what it felt like. To be afraid every day. To feel unwelcome in a place that should be safe. I did not understand before. He paused. I'm trying to be better. Keep trying, Roy said. That's all anyone can do. The celebration continued around them, music and laughter filling the commons. Dr. Westfield joined Roy, holding a beverage that definitely wasn't regulation. You look thoughtful. Regretting your career change? No, Roy said. Just thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was pushing a mop, trying to stay invisible. Now I'm coordinating safety protocols and attending cultural celebrations. You were never invisible, she said. You just worked in places people chose not to look. That's different. Commander Holloway approached with several other human workers from around the station. They'd formed a loose association over the past months, supporting each other and advocating for better working conditions. Small changes were happening, slower than anyone wanted, but happening. Fletcher, Holloway said. Council approved the expanded safety program. They're creating similar coordinator positions on 3 other stations, using your protocols as the baseline. You're becoming famous. Roy laughed. Famous for being stubborn and making trouble. Famous for giving a damn when it wasn't convenient, Holloway corrected. That's rarer than you think. As the evening wound down, Roy found himself standing near the observation windows, looking out at the stars beyond. Pip joined him there, lights soft and contemplative. Do you miss cleaning? The child asked. Sometimes, Roy admitted. It was simpler, quieter, but you help more people now. Maybe. Or maybe I just make different kinds of messes that need cleaning up. Pip's lights shifted through patterns that Roy had learned meant amusement. My father says you are still a foolish guardian, but now the whole station knows it. So you must be guardian more carefully. Roy smiled. Your father's probably right. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching ships come and go from the station. Behind them, the commons filled with the sounds of multiple species learning to exist together, not perfectly but honestly. Problems remained. Conflicts would arise. But now there were systems in place, people paying attention, channels for addressing issues before they became crises that IT wasn't perfect. The universe still didn't make sense, still contained cruelty and indifference and systematic failures. But it also contained people willing to stand up, to speak out, to protect those who needed protecting even when it cost them everything. Roy thought about his daughter one more time, about her question regarding why the universe seemed so cruel to small things. He still didn't have a complete answer, but he had a partial one, learned through months of choosing courage over comfort. The universe was cruel sometimes, but it also contained people who refused to accept that cruelty, who built small pockets of safety and dignity in the face of indifference. That wasn't everything, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough to change everything. Pip's lights blazed bright against the darkness of space beyond the window, patterns dancing with hope and possibility. Roy watched those lights and thought about all the small choices that had led here, the daily decisions to care when caring wasn't required, to act when action was inconvenient, to see people when society preferred they remain invisible. He'd lost his career as a construction worker, lost his quiet anonymity as a janitor, gained purpose, connection, and a reminder that one person's courage could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. The station hummed around them, thousands of lives intersecting in the vast darkness of space. Not all of those lives were safe. Not all were happy. But more were protected now than before. More were seen. More mattered. And that, Roy thought, was worth everything it had cost. Share.